BLM is dead. Good morning. It's Wednesday, July the 1st, and this is The Drill. Thank you very much. I'm Ron, your host and the only true conservative in the United States today. I created this podcast to reform conservatism. My podcast is short, approximately 5 to 10 minutes long, because shorter podcasts are easier to download and listen to. I've been listening to conservative talk radio since 1989. I've grown up in a socialist household and have learned the tricks of socialism. My podcast is made available through Spreaker and can be heard on iTunes, Spotify, Google, and YouTube. Today, what can I do? Quote of the day, positive news, BLM sells out, and how race hustling got started. All that when I come back. Thank you very much. And let's see here. What can I do? Let's get going here. Let's get organized. Thank you. What can I do? Say no. Be prepared. Play it straight. Be literal. Be intellectual. Have the courage of your convictions. Mind your own business. Think, criticize, trust yourself. Be realistic. Be modern. And stand your ground. Next up, the quote of the day. Thank you. The quote of the day comes from dailyscripture.net. Lord Jesus, unbind me, that I may love you wholly and walk in the freedom of your way of love and holiness. May there be nothing which keeps me from the joy of living in your presence. Up next, good news. Thank you. Does BLM matter? Financially, they do. And this is from an article in Politico. Let me find it here. That's it right there. No, actually not. An article that I guess is from a ABC Channel 6 news. And the title is, As Black Lives Matter donations surge, some want to know where the money goes. The current wave of protests across the United States has spurred an enormous surge in donations to Black Lives Matter and other racial justice and civil rights organizations. But the boost in fundraising has also brought increased scrutiny, calls for greater transparency, and a flurry of conspiracy theories about the organization's spending. One recent Black Lives Matter online petition alone brought in $5 million in contributions. More than financial records indicate the group spent in fiscal year 2019. Black Lives Matter Global Network Managing Director Kaylee Scales told The Times the national outrage over the death of George Floyd in a Minneapolis police custody has become a watershed moment for all black-led organizing groups. In recent weeks, Black Lives Matter has received substantial commitments and contributions from major shareholders and celebrities. Many stars have shared images of receipts from donations to various racial justice groups on social media, and Variety confirmed K-pop boy band BTS donated $1 million to BLM. With this much money suddenly flooding into charitable organizations, questions about how the funds are being spent are perhaps inevitable. One thing Black Lives Matter wants to make clear, despite what you may have seen in viral social media posts by right-wing activists, none of this money is going to the Democrat National Committee. BlackLivesMatter.com uses the platform ActBlue to process donations. ActBlue is popular among Democrat politicians and progressive nonprofits. And a similar service, WinRed, is increasingly utilized by Republicans, but neither platform has any control over how funds are allocated. That has not stopped critics from suggesting otherwise, though. Pundits like Ryan Fournier and Candace Owens have wrongly claimed that ActBlue funnels donations intended for Black Lives Matter to Democrat candidates, with some going as far as to allege the organization is a Democrat money laundering scam. Black Lives Matter leaders have dismissed these conspiracy theories as political disinformation campaign intended to undermine their mission, stressing any donations to the DNC would have to be publicly reported. Amid the influx of new funds, the BLM Global Network Foundation announced last week it is creating a $6.5 million fund to support grassroots organizing work by affiliated groups. Starting July 1st, affiliates can apply for up to $500,000 in multi-year grants. Up next, BLM is dead. Thank you. BLM is dead. BLM sold out. The organization is worth millions. The next time that the BLM founders are on television, hey, I thought this revolution wasn't going to be televised. The next time that you see them, count their gold chains. See what kind of luxury car they arrive in, Bentley or Rolls. BLM couldn't wait to put on a price tag, and Wall Street and Hollywood couldn't wait to buy them. BLM went the way of all radicals in this country. In the 60s, there was Bernardine Dohrn, Bill Ayers, and the king of the yippies, Jerry Rubin. Where are they now? They are living large. Dohrn and Ayers are living in a middle-class suburb of Chicago across the street from the President of the United States. And the last time I saw Rubin, he had cut his hair, shaved his beard, and was wearing a three-piece suit. Marvelous Marvin Hagler said it best. Quote, "It's hard to get out of bed at 5 a.m. to do road work when you're sleeping in silk pajamas," unquote. Think about it. Up next, the 70s influence on race in the United States. Thank you very much. Welcome back. And there is a book that I'm reading about the 70s and the 70s influence on subsequent events, on the way we live our lives today, culturally. And this is chapter 2 called E Pluribus Pluris, from racial integration to, quote, diversity, unquote. And this is about 50 pages long. I'm only going to read about 10 or so pages, and I'll be doing these in installments. So more of this tomorrow and following days. In January 1975, a new situation comedy debuted on CBS, the latest in a series of spin-offs from All in the Family, Norman Lear's comedy about the lovable bigot Archie Bunker and his working-class family in Queens. The Jeffersons focused on the adventures of Archie's black neighbors, George and Louise Jefferson. Unlike the Bunkers, who remained resolutely shabby and blue-collar, the Jeffersons enjoyed social mobility. They had moved up to a deluxe apartment in the sky. The new series prompted viewers and reviewers to take stock of the civil rights revolution. On the one hand, the Jeffersons signaled real racial progress. The nation accepted a middle-class series about a middle-class black family in a mostly white neighborhood, at a time when few black characters appeared regularly on television, and most of those lived in stereotypically dire straits. That was quite an achievement. The series even featured an interracial couple, the Willises, who kissed passionately on the screen. Naming its principals Jefferson, after the founding father most closely associated with the notion of human equality, the series touted the fundamental equality of all Americans. It envisioned a place where individuals were judged by the content of their characters, not the color of their skin. Some critics wondered whether the show was not too optimistic. The interracial Willis family encountered hostility from no one but the insufferable George Jefferson. and George's frequent troubles owed more to his own boorishness than the trials of institutional discrimination. Washington Post reporter Joel Dreyfus worried about the dangerous political message in a program that never seems to show George challenged by racism. But if the Jeffersons offered a world without overt racial hostility, it still depicted the clash of irreconcilably conflicting white and black cultures. It seemed to concede the ultimate futility of integration in American life. Most of the series' humor, George Jefferson's disdain for and inability to understand honkies, the liberal white characters' amusing and patronizing efforts to talk jive, derived from the juxtaposition of utterly foreign manners and morals. The Jeffersons were foreigners in upper-class New York society. It was as if the series had placed a Frenchman on the Upper East Side, or, as the Jeffersons actually did for comic effect, an Englishman. The Jeffersons marked the crest of the Civil Rights Movement, the summit of its material achievements, and the beginning of the end of the integrationist ideal. The public purpose of the 60s, the shared commitment of minority activists, liberal intellectuals, and northern white voters to removing explicit racial barriers, gave way in the 70s. Quote, separate but equal, unquote. The mantra of Southern segregationists had become anathema as a concept and as a public policy. But the idea of distinct groups with their own culture and politics, their own objectives and destinies, would prove more enticing and more enduring than 60s Americans might have imagined. George Jefferson and the new ideal of diversity would take Americans far from Thomas Jefferson's vision of equality. The Civil Rights Revolution, a scorecard. The Civil Rights Revolution breached the previously insurmountable wall of racism in American law, politics, education, and economic life. Black students flooded into the nation's colleges and universities. By the mid-70s, black enrollments in institutions of higher learning equaled the representation of African Americans in the nation at large, and as many black high school graduates, in percentage terms, went on to college as did their white counterparts. In 1974, 600 black students matriculated at the University of Alabama, once a symbol of the white South's massive resistance to the struggle for racial justice. The university's famous football squad fielded an integrated roster, and segregationist Governor George Wallace was on hand to crown a black woman as the school's 1973 homecoming queen. African Americans also moved into politics and public life. In the decade after the passage of the Voting Rights Act, the polls opened to millions of previously disenfranchised and dispossessed voters. In the southern states where blacks had never exercised the fundamental rights of democracy, registration rates doubled, and the numbers of black public officials multiplied. In 1967, Cleveland voters elected Carl Stokes, the first African-American mayor of a major American city. Stokes and new black mayors in Detroit and Atlanta launched a wave of firsts during the early 70s. The first African-American admiral in the U.S. Navy, the first black Southerners elected to Congress since Reconstruction, the first black secretary of the Army, the first black bishop in the Episcopal Church, the first black member of the New York Stock Exchange. Desegregation opened hotels, restaurants, and other public accommodations to people of all races and helped narrow the economic gap between whites and minorities. As the federal government moved aggressively to end local segregation, the budget of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission exploded from a token $3 million in 1966 to more than $111 million by the end of the 70s. By 1972, every department of the federal government possessed its own equal opportunity office. Meanwhile, the poverty rate for black households declined. Although black families remained far more likely to suffer deprivation than whites, the racial gap closed steadily between 1959 and 1974. Even some of the most encrusted attitudes about race seemed to be falling by the wayside. In 1963, half of white survey respondents said they would object if a member of their family, quote, wanted to bring a black friend home for dinner, unquote. By 1982, only 22% demurred. In 1958, nearly two-thirds of white voters told pollsters that they would refuse to vote for, quote, generally well-qualified, unquote, black candidate for president, even if nominated by their own party. A quarter century later, 80% of white voters claimed they would support such a candidate. But the rise of the black middle class offered the most dramatic evidence of racial progress. Over the past 30 years, the number of black families officially labeled as affluent by the Census Bureau, with household incomes exceeding $50,000, mushroomed by more than 400%. A church-going, home-owning, child-rearing, backyard barbecuing, traffic jam-cursing black middle class flourished, notable only, according to one analyst, quote, for the very ordinariness which its members go about their classically American suburban affairs, unquote. Nowhere else was this more apparent than in the sprawling subdivisions of Prince George's County, Maryland, on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. Prince George's had evolved from the virtually all-white to a majority black county, while the average income and educational levels increased and property values soared. Historically, the term black bourgeoisie had applied to African Americans at the top of a segregated and degraded community. Pullman porters, barbers, head waiters, ministers, undertakers. By the end of the 70s, black middle class denoted simply that the segment of the nation's middle class that happened to be black. Let's try that again. By the end of the 70s, black middle class denoted simply, quote, that segment of the nation's middle class that happened to be black, unquote, one no longer dependent on the patronage of a segregated black economy. The Civil Rights Revolution had won a great triumph. But it ought to also been a horrible failure. Stagnation settled onto the United States in the mid-70s, slowing the economic progress of black Americans. Economic malaise particularly injured working-class blacks, many of whom fell into poverty and despair. At the same time, a disproportionately large number of middle-class blacks drew their sustenance from government jobs. Many private employers remained unwilling to hire and especially to promote racial minorities. It was no accident that Prince George's County bordered the nation's capital. Quote, the desegregation of public facilities cost nothing, unquote, Martin Luther King Jr. noted just before his death. Quote, neither did the election and appointment of a few black public officials, unquote. True racial justice could not be had at such bargain prices. The failure of true racial integration, the principal goal of early civil rights activists, highlighted this somber fact. Segregation disappeared in arenas of casual contact between Americans, restaurants, airports, and train stations, hotel lobbies, but schools and neighborhoods remained rigidly separated. Even thriving middle-class blacks continued to face residential segregation. When a subdivision acquired a visible black presence, it usually tipped, shifting from overwhelmingly white to nearly all black, practically overnight. In this respect, the experience of African Americans contrasted sharply with that of other racial minorities. Prospering Latinos and Asian Americans moved into integrated suburbs without substantial white flight. One leading study of race relations concluded that white Americans simply did not wish to live among black neighbors. In the aftermath of the Civil Rights Revolution and urban racial disturbances of the 60s, whites fled the triple-decker row houses and high-rise apartments of urban America. In Boston, blacks had accounted for less than 10% of the hub's population in 1960. By 1980, they made up 22%. Whites emptied out of Detroit, Cleveland, Baltimore, St. Louis, Milwaukee, Brooklyn, and Buffalo. It was not the allure of greener suburban pastures, but discontent over school desegregation, welfare, and rising black militants that drove city dwellers to the lily white suburbs. Cities with small black populations continued to grow. It was once one big happy Flatbush family, a nostalgic Brooklynite explained to an inquiring sociologist, referring to the borough's main thoroughfare. But now, 95% of them have been mugged and moved away. Nothing else so promoted white flight or exacerbated racial hostility as court-ordered busing. In a series of decisions in the early 70s, the Supreme Court addressed the persistent problem of school segregation, still lingering 15 years after the court's landmark Brown decision. In Swan v. Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education, a unanimous court ruled that preservation of neighborhood schools could no longer justify racial imbalance. Swan authorized drastic measures. awkward, inconvenient, and even bizarre in some situations, to maximize desegregation and specifically recommended busing as a remedy. 2 years later, the court applied this doctrine outside the South for the first time. In Keyes versus Denver School District number 1, the court found northern communities responsible for school board decisions and public policies that had isolated black students just as effectively as any Jim Crow law. Federal courts around the country began issuing desegregation plans. I'm going to leave it there. So I'm bringing this up because I want people my age to remember, try to remember what it was like when they were growing up, and for those that are younger than I am, to understand how things got started. It may seem that just all of a sudden out of nowhere, the whole country has gone crazy, but we've been here before. Rush Limbaugh wrote an article to that effect in his newsletter. As a matter of fact, it was on the cover where it said, "We've been here before," and we have. And I remember that everybody, except it wasn't just Black Lives Matter, it was everybody's, Latinos, it was Native Americans, it was, because there was an incident at Wounded Knee where a bunch of armed Sioux Indians showed up to try to take over the organization or whatever they're doing, and they end up getting into a standoff with the United States Marshal's office. And and then you had Latino organizations that were boycotting lettuce and boycotting grapes under the tutelage of Cesar Chavez. But everybody seemed to be in on the act. There was constant turmoil day after day. You couldn't get away from it. Open the newspaper, and it was somebody else that was protesting or doing a sit-in or taking over this, that, or the other thing. So we've been here before, and we've seen it before. And so again, I just want to remind people that we have, where this came from, and kind of give a timeline of how things have progressed. How did we go? Basically, this article is really about how did we go from integrationist, because that was what this article is working up to right now, is that the whole idea in the 70s, 60s was integration. Yes, we got rid of slavery. Then we got rid of Jim Crow, but people were still living apart from each other. Blacks were living in certain communities. In Pasadena, when I grew up in Pasadena, blacks lived on the Upper West Side, and the rest of the city was for whites. And that was the way it was done. It wasn't. There was nothing official. There's nothing in the city bylaws or anything like that told people where they had to live. That's just the way it was done. If you were white, you lived over here. If you were black, you lived over there. And so the idea from all the thinkers in this country was we need to integrate, that we're going to experience a lot less racial tensions and racial discrimination if people get to know one another. That if whites get to know blacks and understand that blacks are basically, from a human standpoint, no different than they are in terms of what they want for themselves and their families, then white bigotry will give way. So, and then how that integration turned into diversity. And diversity, it became the watchword for what's happening now, where you're having, diversity becomes every racial group becomes separate and has its own identity and its own wants, its own culture, and wants to promote its own culture. So it was a resistance to the idea of integration, of becoming an American. So that's a little bit later in this article. So in the meantime, back in a minute. Who is a true conservative? He is the person that has the courage of his convictions and is confident in what he knows. He's the person that understands that cultural conservatism is more important than political conservatism. He's not selfish, but minds his own business. He acts like an adult. He's patriotic and uses common sense. He expresses what he knows and does so with certainty. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He is consistent, credible, and influential. not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He is a normal American, and he is better than the socialist. He's a better friend, father, brother, family member, and a better person, period. You have to know that. If you don't know with every fiber of your being that being a true conservative is best, then you're wasting your time. And that brings me to the end of another episode of The Drill. Remember, be honest, be smart, be beautiful. And always ask yourself, what is real? How do I know? What do I do about it? I'm Ron, and that is The Drill.